and welcome back to Introduction to XPage's Development, a video blog series at pauldn.com, Part 2, Creating an XPage. This blog series is based on the Introduction to XPage Development course, a free course that you can download from tlcc.com. In this second part in the series, I'll be covering the material in the Creating an XPage lesson in Module 2. When you push the button to create a new XPage, you're interrupted with the new XPage dialog. There you must provide a name for your XPage. You also have the option to provide a comment for your XPage. And there is also the option to add a data source at the time you create the XPage. So you can add a Domino View data source or a Domino Document data source, or you can wait till after you've actually created the XPage design element and then add it afterwards within the XPages editor. In the XPages editor, the process of developing your XPage involves dragging a control from the controls palette onto the XPage and then setting the properties for the control in the properties view. For an action type control like a button, you add code to its onClick event in the events view and repeat, adding additional controls to develop the complete user interface and the business logic for the XPage application. If you completed the activities in Module 1, you created a new working set and you added all of the activity databases for the course into that working set. So you should have a workbench database in your working set. And in addition, you'll have the data sources, the parts database, customers, and the sales database. And there's also a couple of other customer databases for the demonstrations and activities at the end of this course. Also, from your window menu, you should have opened the XPages perspective whenever you're working on an XPages application. So I'm going to create a new XPage, but before I do that, I'm going to create a brand new application and then create my new XPage in this empty application. So from the File menu, choosing File, Application, New. I'm going to create it locally, give it the file name design.nsf, and use the blank template to get an empty application. I'm prompted to add this new application into my existing open working set. I'm going to say yes and go ahead and do that. In the Applications Navigator, I can expand the design NSF and I can see it is empty. There's no forms. There's the one untitled view, no XPages, no custom controls, no other elements. And I wanted to start fresh to see the impact of creating new XPages and adding new XPages related resources into this empty design NSF application. So to create the XPage, in your XPages design list, you push the button to create a new XPage. And in the new XPage dialog, you give it a name. And I'm going to call it My First XPage. There are some restrictions here. You cannot have spaces. So if I put in space test, it doesn't like that. Also doesn't like things like periods and dashes. Doesn't like any of those. You can go with an underscore. If I can hit that, there's an underscore. So that's acceptable. But for now, just going to call it My First XPage. You can optionally add a comment for your XPage. Like other design elements, you can create it in the design database that you're working in or in another application. You also have the option to add a data source at the time you create the XPage. So you can check off the option and choose to create a Domino View data source if you want to display the contents of a Domino View, or a Domino Document data source if you want to display the contents of existing Domino documents. But for now, I'm going to deselect that and just create My First XPage. The new XPage is opened in the XPages design editor. At this point, all we see is a big blank canvas. You drag controls from the controls palette onto your XPage design editor as you build out the XPage UI and the XPage functionality. But before we add anything to this XPage, let's take a look at what we have so far. So when I expand the outline view, I can see that I have an XML language statement at the beginning, and then I have an element for the XPage itself, XPage, as it shows up in the outline view. With that selected, when I switch to the source view, I can see the start and end tags for that XPage root element, XPView and end XPView. So all content that you add into this XPage, any buttons that you add, any edit box controls for field entry will go between that XPView and XPEndView tag. There are two approaches to add controls to your XPage. The first approach is to choose the control to add from the controls palette and then drop it onto the XPage design editor or into the XPage's source editor at the location to add the control. The advantage of this approach is you can customize the controls palette to include just the controls you most frequently use for a specific XPage's development project. Rather than select a control to add, another approach is to choose the other option at the top of the controls palette and then drag that to the location in the XPage editor to add a new control. You are then interrupted with the Create Control dialog, and from there you can choose from all of the available controls, even those not listed in the controls palette. The outline view provides a hierarchical representation of all of the controls and elements you add to the XPage. Its primary function is a selection function, so when you select a control or an element in the outline, it shows as selected in the design editor and its properties are displayed in the properties view and its events are displayed in the events view. The outline view is quite useful when working in the XSP source editor. Notice how the complete XML source shows as selected for the selected edit box control in the outline view. The outline view also provides limited editing functionality where you can right-click on an element in the outline and then choose to delete it from the context menu. You can also drag and drop elements in the outline to affect their move on the XPage. This image is showing the different error indicators when you have a compile time error. There will be error icons in the application's navigator for the application and XPage element that has an error. The Problems view will show an error count in its title bar and a list of all of the errors with a description. You can double-click on an error in the Problems view to open the XPage to the line with the problem in the XSP source editor. So back here in Designer, working on creating my first XPage, I'm going to begin by adding a title and subtitle to the top of my XPage. But before I add these titles, I'll first add a panel to contain these titles. In fact, I personally will use panels to group any content that I add to an XPage. Panels are like divs. In fact, when they're rendered in the browser client, they are converted to divs. So like divs, panels allow you to group controls on your XPage and then apply styles or style classes to the contents of the panel. There is an XPdiv control, but I prefer the XPage's panel control because it offers a number of advantages, like I can add a data source to a panel or an access control list for a panel. The big one for me is I can choose to perform a partial refresh on a panel and its contents as opposed to refreshing the entire XPage. So with my panel in place and identified as panel 1, I can begin to enter from the keyboard my title. Big Oak Golf. And a couple of line returns or breaks. And now I'll add a subtitle as well. But to do that, I'm going to do this a little differently. I'm going to go to the XSP source editor, and first I'll issue a Control-Shift-F to format the source so the child tags are indented under their parent tags. And I'm going to add the H2 tag for my subtitle, customer information, and I'll end that with an H2 tag as well, and I get some pop-up help where I can select the ending tag. So like in your form design, you can add pass-through HTML directly into the XSP source editor. Now, in my source editor, when I select the start tag for my panel, I can see that the corresponding end tag is also highlighted, and I can also see that the name that I gave in the Properties view, Panel 1, is actually setting the ID property for that control. So almost every control will have an ID property. You may be specifying the name of that control in the properties, but you're actually specifying the ID property if you take a look at the source. If you look at the Start View tag, the root tag for my XPage, you can see this statement XML_NS:XP equals and an indication of the core XPages library. So that is the namespace, and any tag that begins with an XP, like XP panel or XP view, comes from that core library. So there are other libraries as well, like the extension library. So if you add a data view or a dynamic view panel control onto your XPage, then they will have an XE colon prefix to indicate that they're from that extension library. So pass-through HTML can be added to your XPage in the XSP source editor, like this H2 tag, but since this is an XML document, the XML rules apply, like the well-formed rule, which states that every start tag must be terminated with a corresponding end tag, or using the short form notation. So if I were to add a start BR or break tag and then save this XPage, I get a compile time error. There's a problem in my problems view and an indication that I need a matching terminating /BR tag to terminate this tag. And I can add that to properly terminate it. Or I can use the short form syntax to terminate that tag as well. And if I again save my XPage, my problem goes away. Back in the design editor, I can see the subtitle that I added with the H2 tag. And I can see in my outline this H2 element. These line breaks were line breaks that I added in the design editor. This BR element was the break that I added in my XSP source. What I don't see in my outline is anything for this text that I entered directly onto the XPage. And this is not a good practice. It's a common practice in form design to label your fields with text directly on your form, but in XPage design, it's better to have a control or an HTML element, and that way you can style it with a style sheet class. However, for now, we will continue with this inline text, and I can select that and go to the properties and go to the Style tabs to style this inline text. And I can choose a different font and, well, let me select that text once again and choose a different font for Dana and a different size, 24 point, and we'll go with our corporate green color. And we'll select bold as well. Okay, and now I'd like to preview that, so I'm going to save my changes and preview. And there it is in my browser. And I'm seeing my title and subtitle. A couple of things, I would like to center this, but also I don't like this zero margin where everything is up right against the left and right to the top. So I'm going to add some margins around this. And that was one good reason for using a panel. So with my panel selected in the design editor and in the outline as well, I can go to the style tabs for my panel and apply some styling, so some margining and whatever I set here. I'll put a left margin of 25 pixels and the same for right, top, and bottom. So whatever styling that I apply here is going to be applied to each or all of the elements contained within that panel. Another good reason why I use panels. I can also go to the Font tab and choose Center Alignment to center the contents of that panel as well. Then I can save and preview that, and that's what I get. I can see the top margin, I can see the center alignment for all of the content within that panel. Rather than adding inline styles for every panel I add to my XPage, I can export my inline styles. So with my panel selected, I can see in the source, I can see a style tag indicating the inline styles for this particular panel. And on the Style tab in my properties, I can see all of the inline styles at the top here. And there's an export button to export those. And I can choose which ones of the styles that I want to export. And aligning center, I mean, that's pretty specific to maybe a header panel. But these other ones here for the margins, these I'm going to use over and over again. So I'm going to create a new style sheet called My Styles. I'll create that right here in my Design NSF database and OK. So into my styles, I'm going to export those particular margin styles, and I need to give that a style class name, and I'll call that margins 25. And with this option here, apply this style class to the selected control and remove the custom formatting. It's going to apply that margins 25 style and remove the inline styling. So I'll say OK. And the result of that is I have a new design element. I can see my styles.css open in the editor, and I can see the contents of that style sheet. I'll close that. And in my applications navigator, I can see in my resource under style sheets, my styles.nsf or CSS, pardon me. And also in my XPage, when I select that and go to the resources, I see that this style sheet was added to the XPage. And for my panel, when I go to the Style tab, I can see margins 25 is the class, the style class that's being used for this panel. And this inline styling remains, the text alignment center. Okay, so I can see in the source, style equals text alignment center, and I can see this style class equals margins 25 to apply that style class. So to continue on, I'm now going to add a table with labels and input controls to capture the customer name and the email for my customers. But before that, in my container controls area, once again, I'm going to add a panel. I like to add all of my content inside identified panels. I'll identify this one as panel 2. And on the Style tab, I can apply the margins 25 style class that I've already created to get those styles immediately on that panel. So we'll select that. Now into my styled panel 2, I'm going to add a table, and I can do it from here in the container controls. I can drag that right into my panel. Another approach is to select Other at the top of the controls palette, and then select the location to add another control. And when you click at that location, you're interrupted with this Create Control dialog, and from here you can choose any of the available controls. So under Container Controls, I can see Table, which I want to add, but I can also see Div. So that doesn't show in my Controls palette as an option right now. The Controls palette can be customized. You can choose what controls you want to add. Now, I'm not going to add a div. I'm going to add a table control instead. So I'll select that and OK. And then I'm interrupted with this dialog, and I want 2 rows and 2 columns. So I'll just click OK for the defaults to accept those defaults. Like in form design, I'll add input controls into the second column to capture the name and the email, and I'll add labels for my input fields in the first column in my table. But I won't add these as inline text. I'll add the proper control for adding labels, which is the label control. And this offers me the advantage of styling all of my labels with a single style class. For this label, I'll change the default label property to something more descriptive like customer name. Then I'll add a second label, and for this one, I'll change the label property to email. The edit box control is used to capture text and number and date values, so I'll add one of those next to each of my customer name and email labels. Okay, time to preview those changes, so I'll preview those in a browser, and I'll save and compile those changes, and I can see that my margins 25 style class is being applied to my panel, my containing panel, for the labels and input controls, and I can enter into those input controls. For those labels, I'd prefer to apply a style class to these 2 labels, customer name and email, and all of my labels that I might add to this XPage so that they appear in bold. So I can turn on my Chrome Developer Tools, Control-Shift-I, and I can select one of these label elements. So I'll select this customer name label, and I can see the style class that's being applied right now, the IBM style class XSP text label. So I can select that style class, XSP text label. It has a font weight of normal that's being applied right now. And I can copy that style class into the My Styles style sheet that I created earlier. So I'll just copy that, return to Designer, edit the My Styles style sheet, and paste in the XSP text label style class, and change that font weight from normal to bold. So now wherever I use this resource, the My Style style sheet, the label controls will now use the bold font weight. I'll save and I'll close this. Here on my first XPage, I already added the My Style style sheet as a resource, so when I preview again, I now see that all the labels are now in bold. I can Control-Shift and I once again to view my Chrome Developer Tools. I can select one of these labels. I'll select this email label, and I can see there are now two XSP text label style classes with the font weight bold style in mystyles.css overriding the font weight normal from the IBM supplied XSP text label style class. This concludes part 2 of our Introduction to XPage's development series. In this part, I covered the material in the Creating an XPage lesson in Module 2, and you can review the lesson for additional details, and you should also go on to complete the activity for that lesson. In part 3, we'll continue with displaying a domino view on an XPage, and until then, so long for now.